You're listening to the Alchemical Tech Revolution, and I am your host, Wayne McRoy. Good evening, good morning, wherever you are around the world. Tonight, we're going to look into, first and foremost, the Book of Revelation, and we're going to connect some dots for you people here tonight that you've probably never heard connected before. But primarily, what we're going to talk about is something that Rudolf Steiner touched upon very much in his works, and this is what is the Incarnation of Ahriman, and we're going to explore its connection to the digital world that we see being built up all around us. And I just came to the realization and the notice this past week that nearby in the town in which I live, they are building an AI data center. Now, I find this hugely concerning. These things are cropping up all over the place. And we're going to see the influence of artificial intelligence and this whole system they're putting in place influencing things in a very real way in the very near future. The implications of the electrical usage that this thing will probably take up is concerning on the surface level here. But beneath that, of course, it's all about data collection. So there's this data center going in. And this has really raised a red flag for me. I never thought it would come to the community in which I live because it's a slightly rural area, and they began to clear the ground to build this data center, and I find that interesting that they chose a location that is not exactly urban in its layout, but certainly I guess it fits the need that they're looking for. They need enough land to build it on, and this plot of land that was available seems to fill that bill nicely. But before we get into that, the Incarnation of Ahriman and the digital world, and we'll point the way for you to see how these things do interconnect, we're going to discuss first a little bit that's laid out in the Book of Revelation, in chapter 13 of the Book of Revelation. Now, scholars and theologians for years have puzzled over the meaning of some of what is presented in the Book of Revelation, and many others have looked at it and scratched their heads with wonder, thinking, what could this possibly be talking about? Well, we're going to connect the dots with you a little bit here tonight. And most people won't touch this with a 10-foot pole, but I'm going to, because what's being inferred in the scriptures in Revelation chapter 13, talking about the beast, clearly has connections to the Kabbalah. And the ideas represented in the Kabbalah, and this is what the beast truly is, and we'll see how it's a synthetic or artificial inversion of the natural processes of things, and it's something that's been around for a very long time and is seeking to incarnate here in a way in which was not possible before, because it violates the natural order. And we'll touch upon all of that. But first, let's read directly from the Book of Revelation, and then we'll connect the dots some more, and we'll get into the meat of the matter, this whole notion of the incarnation of what Steiner calls Ahriman. And I see this, if you've listened to this program for any length of time, you may have heard me describe this before. I see this as being one aspect of the Antichrist. And we'll touch on that a little bit as we go. Revelation chapter 13. This is John the Revelator recording this. Then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. Going to pause before we continue. A beast rising up from the sea. A watery beast, if you want to call it that. There's so many implications to the term the sea. In occultism and Kabbalism, the sea refers to the abyss, also known as the underworld, the void of chaos, hell, if you want to call it that, in the Christian viewpoint. The sea. So this beast comes up out of the sea. Now remember, we'll connect the dots here as we go, because a lot of this has puzzled theologians, scholars, and just anybody who's really looked at this in any depth, people studying eschatology. It's puzzled them for years. Well, the missing piece is if they are unaware of the secret doctrine taught by the mystery schools and the occult fraternities, they don't know how to apply this hermeneutical lens to the Scripture. And that's what I'm going to do here tonight. We're going to apply the hermeneutical lens that we are given by knowing what these secret doctrines are, the alchemical lens, if you want to call it that, or the Kabbalistic lens is probably the more appropriate way to view this, because that's wherein the ideologies are being represented here symbolically, in what's being shown to John the Revelator in the spiritual realms in this text as he recorded it. So let's continue with verse 2. Now the beast which I saw was like a leopard. His feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. The dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. Going to pause again. Now we're talking about the dragon. You'll notice there are 3 aspects to this that will turn up. This is describing the beast in the book of Revelation. The beast, also known as being synonymous with the Antichrist, it is part of the artificial trinity, the synthetic or inverse trinity of the Holy Bible. The beast, the Antichrist, and the false prophet. That is how they delineate them in much Christian theological teaching. But we'll see, there's another portion to this, and you'll notice a little something about this context when we look at it and we break it down into some of its simplest terms. Right now we're talking about the dragon. So we have the dragon and we have the beast that rises up out of the sea. And this is an allusion back to the creature that is named in the book of Job earlier in the Bible, called Leviathan. Leviathan from the sea. This is one part, one of the unholy trinity of the Antichrist figure, as we shall see. And I saw one of his heads as if it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed. And the world marveled and followed the beast. So they worshipped the dragon, who gave authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, Who is like the beast? Who is able to make war with him? And he was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and he was given authority to continue for 42 months. Going to pause for a moment. So now this is laying out the context of what is called the Great Tribulation in the Bible, or the 7-year tribulation. This is the first half of the tribulation for the 42 months. That's 3.5 years. It's split into 2 portions, the tribulation and the Great Tribulation afterwards. And there's a lot of discussion in Christian circles as to when exactly they think the rapture will take place, or if there even will be a rapture. There's been a lot of disagreement on this through the years in theological circles, and this is one of the reasons why, because they break down these time periods in here. But what they don't realize is this is all symbolic. It's not speaking about a literal 7-year period in the context that we're looking at it in. Now, you can apply that literalist context to it if you want to. That is just one lens of viewing Scripture or interpreting Scripture. This is called hermeneutics, and I just did a series on advanced hermeneutics, stepping outside the traditional bounds of the biblical interpretations of things and applying the lens of observation of the mystery schools, the secret doctrine, to a lot of this. And that's the missing piece for interpreting much of what's laid down in the eschatological literature. So let's continue on. Now remember, we have the beast rising from the sea. This is Leviathan. We have the dragon. So what's the third portion of the unholy trinity, the inverse trinity? Then he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name, his tabernacle, and those who dwell in heaven. It was granted to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and authority was given him over every tribe, tongue, and nation. And who dwell on the earth will worship him, whose names have not been written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. He who leads into captivity shall go into captivity. He who kills with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and faith of the saints. Now pay close attention to this next part, because this will show you the third member of the unholy Trinity, and then we'll connect the dots for you further so you can understand what's being revealed here. Then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb and spoke like a dragon. And he exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence, and causes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. Gonna pause. So now you'll notice this second beast came up out of the earth. Let's reference back once again to the book of Job earlier in the Bible, where we learned about Leviathan, the watery dragon. And then Job also mentions Behemoth, the land dragon, the earth dragon, the earth and the water. These, in the old philosophical context, are the elements that represent physicality. And we have these 2 serpentine forces, Leviathan and Behemoth, conjoined together into the dragon. So here are your 3 aspects of Antichrist: Leviathan, Behemoth, and the dragon. The dragon represents manifestation in physicality of the beast, this combined chimera that is the combination of Leviathan and Behemoth. And if you've been following this program for any length of time, you might know what this implies. You see, this is the creation of what the Kabbalists call Tannin Iver. Tannin Iver is the dragon, is the physical manifestation of Antichrist in this world, and it probably won't look a thing like you think it will. But it is the reptilian archetype, this Tannin Iver manifestation, the dragon, the beast of the book of Revelation, the beast associated with Antichrist, one and the same as Antichrist, a portion of Antichrist. Now this crosses the bounds into different teachings from the Kabbalists and from the various mystery schools and occult fraternities, where we could see this threefold combination of this entity now merged together into this Tannin Iver, which the Kabbalists say, if that ever happens, will destroy the world, and certainly that is what is intended. The beast that we're speaking of course, corresponds to Antichrist in the Bible. And like I said, it's probably not going to look a thing like you think it will. Let's continue through the scripture. So we just mentioned in verse 12 here that this first beast had a deadly wound that was healed, an injury to the head, and we see certain things that have happened in the real world, if you want to call it that seem to correspond with this archetype. Now, don't get me wrong. It is an archetype, and I don't know if you could take that as a literal interpretation on that level with this. But the whole point is we're seeing the signs of the times, the symbols, the archetypes in the greater zeitgeist, the synchromystic metadata, if you will, that is pointing in this direction of the blueprint laid out in the book of Revelation here in chapter 13. Let's continue. And we're just going to finish up chapter 13, and then we're going to get into the real context of tonight's episode. He performs great signs, so that he even makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. And he deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he has been granted to do in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast, who was wounded by the sword and lived. He was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. He causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, and that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. His number is 666. And that's the end of Revelation chapter 13. And we're going to explore this avenue of thought here a little further as we look into a little bit of an analysis of some of the works of Rudolf Steiner. And we're going to connect the dots for you to things we're seeing happening in the world right now, things related to the rise of this digital realm and the attachment of people to this digital realm. Things that scholars and Christian theologians in the past could not possibly have understood at the level that we do today. And we'll see how this all aligns with what we just read in the book of Revelation. So Steiner says that the Ahrimanic incarnation will happen in the West in the third millennium. In his nomenclature, West means primarily Britain and English-speaking America. There is ample reason to suspect that the destined place for this event is North America, for the effect of the American natural environment on the human body and soul especially favors Ahrimanic tendencies. According to Steiner's insights, each of the various regions of the earth has its unique effect upon the human organism. In America, the Ahrimanic influence is strong, rising from the center of the earth, carried by electromagnetism. This strengthens the entity known to occultism as the human double, or the doppelganger. Gonna pause for a moment here. Now we're going to connect some more dots that have never been connected for you before. And you're going to learn some things. If you're not familiar with what Steiner's referring to with these Ahrimanic forces, essentially, the best way I could describe this for you is anything that is considered to be an Ahrimanic influence will steer you into the direction of hyper-physicality or hyper-materialism. That way of thinking in which this physical reality that we sense with our five senses is all that exists, and all phenomena, inclusive of consciousness itself, can be explained away as the cause and effect sequence of some physical, material world cause and effect sequence. This is what they want you to believe. This is the Spirit of Ahriman at work, and this we could cite it as an example. As I said, they want you to think of consciousness as nothing more than the byproduct of the electrochemical activity of the brain and brainstem. And if you believe that, that is the Ahrimanic influence at play, steering you away from spiritual concerns. That is what the Spirit of Ahriman is all about. It's all about the inversion principle. It's all about trapping man in physicality. Building the eighth sphere, as Steiner so aptly called it. So now we're talking about this Ahrimanic influence strengthens what is known in the occult teachings as the doppelganger, or the human double. You may have heard Jungian psychology describe this as the shadow. Doing the shadow work, that's how they like to frame it in the reference of what you could call psychological alchemy. It's all about processing this shadow into yourself in order to attain a type of gnosis of sorts. These are the things they teach and believe in many of the secret schools. Let's read on. This doppelganger is an Ahrimanic soul being with intelligence and will, but with no individual spiritual ego, and tends to bind the human soul to the body, hardening human thinking, feeling, and willing. All men have a doppelganger living in their nerve electricity, infusing into their souls all sorts of degrading, depressing impulses, as well as instigating internal illnesses. Gonna pause for a moment here. That's right, we have a spiritual double a doppelganger, the human double that lives with us. This is described in much of the literature as the quote-unquote animal nature of man, the lower nature that man must conquer with his higher nature. This notion of the higher man and the lower man is represented in the symbol that is known as the Sphinx. The head being that of man, representing the higher spirit of man, the higher portion of man, and this doppelganger, or human double, the lower man, the animal nature. So it's about the spiritual nature overcoming the animal nature. This is what has been talked about and symbolized throughout all of time within these mystery schools and within these occult teachings. And this is what this represents. We have this doppelganger. It is a type of intelligence that does not have a soul of its own. It is not an individuated being. It is not an individual ego, as man is. If you explore these things in the parlance or language that the occultists offer us, they say that you are an ego. This is the higher man, the spirit man. And we have various other vehicles in which we exist. These are bodies. Other bodies that man has. We are a four-square and yet threefold being, according to the mystery teachings. Not only do we have this physical body or vehicle that we're all familiar with, we also have what is called an etheric body or vehicle, an astral body or vehicle, and a mental vehicle that is known as the ego, or the individuated self. This doppelganger, or human double, or more rightly called Ahrimanic double, does not have that individuated ego. So this doppelganger lacks that portion of individuation of the human being, but it has a type of intelligence of its own, and it leads us astray in many regards. It steers us to our animalistic nature. This could also be corresponded out to the principles laid down by Sigmund Freud and others, where you have the id, the ego, and the superego. This doppelganger, or Ahrimanic double, would correspond to the id. It seeks out its animalistic nature. It seeks to fulfill its desires. Now, this Ahrimanic double doesn't have a physical vehicle of its own, therefore it manifests in yours, and does not have an etheric vehicle of its own, therefore it manifests within yours, but it does have a somewhat separated astral vehicle, representing the desire world. Let's read on. The Ahrimanic tendencies in America are well known even to those whose perception is unenlivened by occult knowledge. American culture has long been famous for its violence and hard-boiled materialism, and more recently for its degeneracy and decadence. As to exactly when Ahriman's incarnation will happen, Steiner does not give a precise time. In at least one passage, he seems to indicate that the end of the third millennium. In other places, he indicates the early part of that millennium. In many places, he points to a great crisis at the end of the 20th century, even the notion of the war of all against all. Gonna pause for a moment here. We spoke about this on a previous episode, and are we not seeing the birth pangs of such a war of all against all coming to culmination here in reality before our very eyes? This war of all against all is when mankind might well stand at the grave of civilization. In any case, it seems highly likely that a major Ahrimanic onslaught, either the incarnation of Ahriman himself, or the advent of the false prophet of the apocalypse, or some other attack, occurs sometime within the very near future here, in the early part of the 21st century. To see why this is so, we need to do a few simple calculations based upon the occult principle of meaningful rhythms in history. Let the skeptical listener here be a true skeptic and suspend judgment, and take in the following discussion with an open mind to possibilities unsuspected by the materialist mind. Gonna pause for a moment here before we continue. This text we're reading from here tonight is called The Advent of Ahriman, written by Robert Mason. We have covered portions of this paper here before, because this guy has a very good view as to the teachings of Steiner. What's being addressed here has the ring of truth to it in many ways, and we can see these spiritual manifestations beginning to occur in the world around us, even though nobody really knows the timing of how this will all happen for sure. Now, as the author of this paper here laid out just in the previous sentence or two, Steiner had mentioned this advent or incarnation of Ahriman as having occurred either towards the end of the third millennium, and that's the millennium we're in now, or the beginning part. There's no clear delineation as to when this will occur, and I don't think the nature of this event is something that can be accurately predicted by anybody. For the Bible informs us that no man, nobody, no one knows the timing of all of this aside from God the Father himself. So anyone who tells you this will happen at such and such a date, well, they are mistaken, because no man knows when these things will occur. No man knows when this 7-year tribulation will set in, when these end-time events will occur, or what exactly they're going to look like. We've made all kinds of inferences and speculations and assumptions about what the end of time or the end of days is going to look like. And we don't know how this will all shape up to look in the physical world in which we are in now. I suspect things will look very different than how we think they will look, based upon the predictions and the assumptions made by the scholars of the past, the Christian theologians of the past, who've looked at these passages in the Bible and said that this is what the end times will look like, this is what this 7-year tribulation will look like, and they are assuming very many things about this incarnation of the spirit of Antichrist. And this was talked about by Steiner in regards to what he calls this incarnation of Ahriman, which is one particular facet of Antichrist, in my view. So this incarnation of Ahriman corresponds with the rise of Antichrist in this world. This is the physical component, the material world component that people are looking for to be the Antichrist. And I think it's been misunderstood by scholars of the past and by theologians across the board because of the nature of the way in which particularly the book of Revelation was written. This is with the perspective of the spiritual worlds. John the Revelator viewed this stuff happening and occurring in the spiritual worlds, and many have interpreted it literally. And it's the wrong hermeneutical lens of observation to use when you're trying to decipher the interpretation of the Scriptures. And in order to have a more accurate view of what's being revealed in the book of Revelation, you need to know a little something about the doctrines that they teach in the secret society groups, because much of this has been encoded into the book of Revelation. Whether people are ready to admit to that or not, that's another story altogether. But certainly this lens of hermeneutical observation needs to be used to view this, and then you can understand a little bit more about what it may actually look like on the physical material world aspect of this as we view this in the upcoming future here. So we have all the archetypes present, and now we're going to look a little bit into some occult history about the advent of this incarnation of Ahriman or Antichrist according to the works of Steiner. And as I always caution you with a lot of this stuff, you do have to take it with a grain of salt. There's no way to really prove nor disprove any of this in an objective, scientific paradigm type of a way, which is largely what's been adopted by our world in this modern culture. So there's no way to truly verify these things, but you can feel within your spirit that there are perhaps some tenets of truth to it. But this is the observations of Steiner, and he goes at this stuff from his own perspective or worldview, and we all have our inherent biases within us, and we see things differently. We have different perspectives on the reality around us. So when you realize that, You can find the value in this, even if you split hairs about the terminology or the ways in which these things are being described by Steiner, or the names attached to it. Understand the archetype, and that's the important factor for all of this. It's the archetype. So, some occult history. And he says, it is a fact, unknown to history, but revealed in Steiner's spiritual research, that while the incarnation of Christ was happening in Palestine, another stupendous drama played out in Mexico. A high initiate of the negative mysteries, the most advanced black magician in the world had reached by repeated ritual murders of an especially horrible kind the threshold of knowledge of certain deep cosmic secrets. This knowledge would have given him the ability, as was his intention, of achieving the Ahrimanic goals of completely rigidifying the Earth, so as to draw it out of the progressive development towards the new Jupiter. Going to pause for a moment. Now, this is according to the doctrines of the Rosicrucians and the other secret schools. We are supposed to be advancing to this next state of world evolution into what they call the Jupiter period, or the Jupiter revolution. And this is supposed to be an era of spiritual advancement of man. And there are these dark forces, these Antichrist forces, that seek to stifle that. That's what he's referring to here. So he says, at the same time, at the advent of Christ, there was a dark magician who achieved a type of apotheosis of his own in Mexico. Like I said, there's no way to prove nor disprove any of this. But let's go ahead and continue reading here. So, the whole point here was to completely rigidify the Earth so as to draw out of the progressive development toward the new Jupiter and the binding of human organisms as automata in the slag of the Earth, or automatons, to make man into a soulless being. He was thwarted in this intention by the incarnate high sun being Huitzilopochtli, who caused the black magician to be crucified at the same time as the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, a shattering reflection in the American continent of the events of Palestine. Going to pause for a moment here. So this is why Steiner claimed that there tends to be a more Ahrimanic influence here in America, in the New World, if you want to call it that, is because at the same time of the advent of Christ, there was allegedly this advent of another being, a being inverse to Christ, that wanted to trap man and destroy his soul. Trap man in physicality. This is the goal of the Ahrimanic influence. But this was thwarted. This was thwarted by the work of Christ being conveyed spiritually in this story as this Huitzilopochtli, sun being in the Mexican peninsula, according to this. And it says, since then, the soul of this black magician has been held in a kind of prison, or a place in the underworld, and this could be construed to the teachings of some of the other mythologies. This could be Apollyon or Apollo imprisoned, if you want to go ahead and connect the dots with that. But this is according to what Rudolf Steiner's occult investigation into things has shown. These are according to his spiritual clairvoyant viewpoints and looking into this, observations into events of the past. This is what he claimed to have seen and understood to be true. So we have the polarity principle at play. Once again here, at the same time that Christ did his salvation event, the mystery of Golgotha as referred to here by the occultists, at the same time that took place, there was the inverse portion of this taking place across the sea, in the land of Mexico, in the Americas. And that is why this Ahrimanic influence remains here and has been seeded here, according to what they say. But let's continue reading. Recall that the Greco-Roman epoch ran approximately 2,160 years, from 747 BC to 1413 AD. The midpoint of this epoch was 1413 AD minus 2,160 divided by 2, which equals 333 AD. Consider, as a hypothesis, the occult teaching that events in history occur at times that, as it were, reflect and balance the events equidistant in time from a midpoint. Taking 333 AD as the midpoint, the fulcrum of the balance, and on one side the birth in Palestine, on the other side of the scales would be 333 AD plus 333 equals 666 AD. The big event, known to history as the 7th century, was the rise of Islam. Another event, not so famous but still known to history, was the transfer of ancient Greek philosophy, especially Aristotle's works, probably including the lost work on alchemy, to the Academy of Jundi Sabur, near present-day Baghdad. Following the expulsion of the philosophers from Syrian Edessa in 489 AD and from Athens in 529 AD, the philosophers had found refuge in what was then the Persian Empire, and at that academy they pursued their calling. Then this knowledge passed to the Islamic Arabs, and science of a particular bent reached a high development under them while Europe was in the Dark Ages. Only gradually, over many centuries, did this science pass over to Europe, where it developed into the modern scientific revolution. Again, the trend of modern science, as it has in fact developed, is Ahrimanic in its nature. The direct ancestor of scientific materialism was the Arabian science, which was itself derived from the Academy of Jundi Sabur. Thus, on the other side of the 333 AD midpoint, from the birth in Palestine was the rise of an active, materialistic, anti-Christian worldview in Jundi Sabur. Occult history, as given by Steiner, reveals how this came about. Sorat, gonna pause for a moment, or Sorath, S-O-R-A-T or S-O-R-A-T-H, another name for part of the Trinity of the Antichrist, the unholy Trinity. Sorat intended to approach physical manifestation in 666 AD in Jundi Sabur, and to bestow upon the philosophers there a superhuman knowledge. This knowledge was to consist of everything that mankind, under the plan of the regular gods, it says here, according to the works of Steiner, or God the Creator, the Father himself, was to learn through its own efforts by the height of the present consciousness soul epoch. This epoch began in 1413 AD. Gonna pause for a moment. This is also commonly known as the Enlightenment period. So this is the beginning of the consciousness soul epoch. This is the transformational phase of mankind into stepping into this next new age, according to the occultists, and according to many of the New Agers that have taken many of these teachings and turned them into something laughable on purpose to get people off the track here with understanding the importance of the cycles of time. So this epoch began in 1413 AD, so its midpoint will be the year 2493 AD. In other words, Sorat, or this one portion of the spirit of Antichrist, wanted to give to mankind prematurely and without the requisite human effort and experience the knowledge that would be right and healthy for mankind to achieve through work and evolution by the middle of the third millennium. The regular God's plan for the consciousness soul epoch is for mankind to acquire, through self-education and self-discipline, the free, conscious, individualized human personality. If the mankind of the 7th century had been given this advanced knowledge at that immature stage of development, when people could not think in full consciousness, the result would have been disastrous. Just consider how much evil mankind has done with the science we have acquired up to now, at our present stage of maturity, or immaturity, depending on how you view it, and then try to imagine what the relatively primitive people of the 7th century would have done with the science of 2493 AD. This picture is bad enough, but we need to recall Steiner's occult insights to begin to get the whole picture. If Sorat had succeeded, we humans would have lost the possibility of developing our true nature and would have become egotistic, animalistic automata with no possibility of further development. Gonna pause for a moment. This is exactly what this Ahrimanic influence seeks to produce in our era right now. This is the building of the 8th sphere, according to what Steiner has said. You see, this Antichrist spirit is attempting to break off humanity from all spiritual connection and trap him in physicality, wherein this Ahrimanic double, the doppelganger, would be a type of automaton influenced only by negative spirits from the underworld who would use that vehicle to manifest physically here in this reality. And we're going to connect some more dots here later when we're done reading through this paper, and you will begin to understand how it relates to the modern era and to things going on in the world today. We would have become earthbound, and the Earth could never then pass over to the Jupiter, Venus, and Vulcan stages. The normal God's plan would have been thwarted, and men could not become the spirits of freedom and love. However, the rise of Islam thwarted this plan of Sorat. It is a deep, mysterious paradox that Islam, which was and is opposed to Christianity in many ways, also in effect worked jointly with the Christ impulse in history by blanketing, by skimming the cream off, this Sorat science, or Ahrimanic science, and by watering it down. Still, this science survived and has worked on into the present day. But the worst was averted for those times. The weakened Jundi Sabur impulse, as a distorted quasi-Aristotelianism, passed to the Arabs over Africa and Spain to realism of the medieval scholastics, especially the revived Aristotelianism of Thomas Aquinas, opposed this Arabian influence, somewhat correctly seeing it as inimical to Christianity, but with the decline and decadence of medieval Aristotelianism and with the dawn of modern anti-Aristotelian empiricism, e.g. from Francis Bacon, the diluted but still powerful Sorat science came to dominate world culture. Going to pause for a moment. The material sciences, the scientific paradigm that we view in the modern worldview as the end-all be-all of the explanation of reality. Scientific method, the establishment thereof, objective ways of measuring physical phenomena. That's what this is talking about. But there are other ways of viewing these things, as we will see here. When we continue reading, there are other versions of science that have not been applied that may, in the very near future, begin to be adopted by mankind. Some of these are the spirit sciences, the soul sciences, and other versions of the physical sciences, as we will see here. Let's continue reading, and then we'll connect some dots for you. The true spirit of this kind of scientism can be illustrated by a telling metaphor coined early in this epoch by scientism's seminal spokesman, Sir Francis Bacon. He said, propounding scientific experimentalism, that we must put nature on the rack and force her to answer the questions we put to her. This figure will speak volumes to those who meditate upon it. We, seeking information for whatever motives, are to torture the goddess, in the terms given here, who gave us birth and nurture, so as to cause her, through unbearable pain and injury, to blurt out secrets which she in her wisdom conceals from the impure and self-seeking. In much of the so-called psychological research and medical training, this is hardly even a metaphor. The torture unto death is quite literal. The usual victims are animals, but all too many researchers are not above using human subjects when they can get enough power over them. And even a slight whiff of occult knowledge shows us a deeper meaning. Gonna pause for a moment before we get to that deeper meaning, just to point out that what Bacon espoused in this Baconian science, or this materialist science that we have today, scientism, what it does is it tortures nature to try to reveal the secrets of nature to it. Think about that. This is an affront to the creation and to the Creator himself. Let's continue. The central rite of Satanism, or black magic, sometimes crude, sometimes sophisticated, is the deliberate ritual torture and killing of animals, and at a more advanced level, of humans. When done in a precise way, this practice confers knowledge and power upon the practitioner. Also, it affects the whole earth, hardening and rigidifying it to the characteristic Ahrimanic purpose. Thus, we can see the hordes of researchers and medical students who hurt, injure, and sacrifice animals as undergoing an unconscious Ahrimanic black magic initiation, which hardens, brutalizes, and Ahrimanizes their souls, and through them also the culture and even the earth itself. Sacrifice is the actual word they commonly use, not thinking which god they sacrifice unto. Vivisection is truly the archetypal act of modern science, as it is generally understood and practiced. And I'm going to pause for a moment. So now you understand the spirit behind scientism, this worldview that has taken over our culture in the modern era. There's a very dark undercurrent to much of what's been promoted. Now, is science in and of itself a bad thing? No. But it is this approach to researching science that has become problematic. You see, it's torturing the answers out of nature. This is not the way we should be going. Is there a juxtaposition to this? There certainly is. Let's read on and we will learn about it. In contrast to our Baconian science, or our modern scientism, there does exist a little-known scientific trend inaugurated by the German poet Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. In the general culture, he is known primarily as the author of Faust, but he was also a scientist known for, if known at all, the prediction of the discovery of the intermaxillary bone in humans, or less often, for his anti-Newtonian theory of color. His mode of scientific thinking was quite different from the Baconian Ahrimanic mode, or the modern scientism, and likewise he illustrated it with a telling metaphor. I'm going to pause for a moment. Now, the ideas put forth by Goethe were more akin to what we would call the old sciences, the classical occult sciences, or alchemy, the work of the alchemists, more so than the modern scientism paradigm. His mode of scientific thinking was different, and this is illustrated with a telling metaphor. He said, in paraphrase, that we must approach nature as a reverent lover, and perhaps she will whisper to us her intimate secrets. This contrast to Bacon's metaphor could hardly be more stark. Also, the Goethean method of scientific investigation, in contrast to amoral experimentalism, is a method of self-improvement and self-development, a reverent meditating upon the facts of experience in the hope that they will speak. This scientific method has, of course, been all but buried underneath the Baconian Ahrimanic avalanche, even in Goethe's own country. And it was no mere accident that Steiner's first professional appointment was to edit Goethe's scientific writings in the Goethe-Schiller archive in Weimar. Steiner and his successors have developed and expanded the Goethean model to an amazing extent, giving us a reasonable hope for renewed life in our own deadened, death-dealing scientific culture. Gonna pause for a moment, that's right. It is a culture of death. Even our very science is a culture of death, and it need not be so. Do you understand the difference between the metaphors given here, between the Baconian model and the Goethean model? Well, there are those who have brought forward the occult sciences in regards to working with the bounds of nature, rather than trying to torture nature into the inversion principle to get things done. That's what our modern scientism is. It's the application of the inversion principle of nature to get things done. It is destructive in nature. All you have to do is look at the example of the combustion engine to understand destructive processes in order to bring about synthesis in this world. That is what is used, and it need not be that way. There are other technologies. You could go back and look at the works of Victor Schauberger. He worked with nature. His technologies worked with nature. His repulsine engine worked with nature and was able to achieve significant results, comparable results. And this is wherein our science has really hit a crossroads in the modern era. Are we going to continue to explore these destructive forms of science that torture nature, or are we going to work within the bounds of nature and step to the next level? Because it's only through working with the bounds and laws of nature that we can step to the next level, rather than trying to torture the answers out of nature. Let's read on. Steiner, too, has been almost totally ignored by scientists in the West, slightly less so in Central Europe. Also, the practice of Goethean Steinerian science has vast implications for the soul of the practitioner as well as for the whole earth. Spiritual science sees soul and spirit in nature in a real practical way, completely consistent with the empirical facts. It reverently approaches the scientific laboratory as a holy place and the experiment as a sacrament, as a revelation of the Creator's spirits through the sacred symbols of nature. This is consistent only with the moral development of the scientist and with the furtherance of God's plan of human and cosmic evolution. And I'm going to pause for a moment here. This was also the way of the original ancient alchemists. This is what they understood, and they did. They worked with nature. They treated nature reverently. It was a holy science. It was not destructive. Although there were phases within the alchemical process that would appear to be destructive, but it's all about utilizing the forces and currents of nature in order to magnify or exalt a particular element within it. That's what the alchemists did. That's what the teachings of alchemy or the old occult sciences did. The original intention. Now all of this has been hijacked and usurped and inverted by modern occultism. And of course, our modern science has done the same. It left out portions of the alchemical process. All you have to do is look at modern pharmaceuticals and compare them to the processes of Spagyria to understand this distinction. In Spagyria, first, you use the Negrito process to break down a particular substance into its constituent parts. And then it goes through other processes that become reintegrated into the tincture, drawing out the spirit of it, or the essence of the substance, and reamalgamating it into an exalted form or principle. Our modern chemistry only uses the first portion of this, the destructive portion. It doesn't reintegrate in the proper way of an exaltation the substance. Therefore, it's missing the spiritual component. Our modern science or scientism is missing the spiritual component. This is what's been leveraged against us. It's only one part of the process, and it is this influence of this Ahrimanic force in this world that has helped to bring this about. So next, we're going to look at this rhythmic cycle according to what this author is saying Steiner was able to identify. The 666-year rhythm continued further. Another period ended in 1332 A.D. Around this time, around circa 1312, the cruel suppression of the Knights Templar began. Little is known to history of the true nature of the Templars because of their secretive nature and the distortions passed to history by their triumphant enemies, but these knights did cultivate an esoteric Christianity that, although somewhat flawed, had the potential of bringing about a more humane civilization in Europe. This possibility was thwarted by the power of the French king, Philip the Fair, and his allies in the Church. Philip, through the torture and killing of the Templars and through the material inspiration from their looted gold, attained a kind of Ahrimanic initiation knowledge, but he died soon thereafterward. The Templars were either killed or driven underground, and medieval culture declined until the Renaissance and Reformation. The Templar impulse did continue underground to pass over to the lodges, especially York and Scottish Rite Freemasonry. These lodges worked in opposition to Roman Catholicism, at least until the end of the 18th century, when Freemasonry and esoteric political Catholicism united in opposition to Napoleon. But the esoteric content of Freemasonry became decadent and Ahrimanized. Nevertheless, many of the modern institutions of liberal republican democracy, such as freedom of speech, religion, and the press, are very largely due to the influence of Freemasonry, especially in the USA. This is a huge and interesting story, but it is beyond the scope of this essay. Gonna pause for a moment. So now we see this Ahrimanic influence was carried forward into the organization and the implementation of Freemasonry in the modern era. And of course, this guy speaks very highly of the Templars. The Templars, as my investigation into them have shown, were very much a conduit of this Ahrimanic influence, not in opposition to it. But you see, these things all play out in the way that they do for a reason. And there's a reason why our modern world is shaped the way that it is. That we see this society and culture we have today. There's a reason it looks how it looks, and it's because of this influence. But we see that much of what's happened has stifled this influence from actually making a lot of headway and usurping this world from the Creator. And certainly our redemption plan was provided for us. We can see that. But there are certain things that are predicted to happen, and when you look at it through the lens of the occultists, all of these different things we're speaking about here, this advent of the Incarnation of Ahriman, corresponds one-to-one with what the Bible tells us about the rise of Antichrist and the end of days, the end of time. And we are seeing these things coming into being in front of our eyes, and like I said, it very likely is not going to look how you think it's going to look, how you've been told it's going to look by those who have pondered this for a very long time within the auspices of the Christian eschatological worldview. They've applied the wrong hermeneutical lens to the Scriptures. And it's only through the understanding of some of the things taught by these secret doctrines that you get a little bit clearer of a view as to what it's going to look like in the physical material world. What's been described to us is from the spiritual perspective. The dark powers that be, these Antichrist influences that be, want us to view only things in the physical way. So they've inverted this spiritual nature. They've inverted these spiritual viewpoints, and they tried to convince much of the Christian scholars and theologians that they needed to look at the book of Revelation and interpret this stuff in a literal sense, and thus have led them astray. You see, the Spirit of Ahriman is very much, or the Spirit of Antichrist is very much a literalist. Does not want you to understand the nuance of symbology. And we see a reflection of that in our modern culture, in the steering of the direction in which man is being led by our modern science. Let's continue, and we'll get to the end of this portion wherein the author of this piece wants to try to attach the time frame that we are in right now to the possible advent of the Incarnation of Ahriman. And of course, another 666-year cycle ends around 1998 AD, As stated already, it is apparent that the Ahrimanic influence in culture is building to some kind of climax. Indeed, as is obvious to all with eyes to see, that civilization in the USA, despite or because of the triumphant march of technology, human culture and civilization are decaying, regardless of erstwhile rising economic indicators. It is an easy guess that the times around 1998 AD are a propitious period for a major Ahrimanic manifestation, perhaps the Incarnation of Ahriman himself, or, since 1998 equals 3 times 666 years since the birth of the body for the Incarnation of Christ, perhaps the body was born, which is to be the vehicle for Ahriman, possibly 30 years later, or perhaps some other major event such as the advent of the false prophet of the apocalypse. Going to pause for a moment. Now, this research paper was written prior to 1998, and this gives us some speculative viewpoints. According to the author of this, based upon the works of Steiner, he predicted that some propitious world event would happen that would bring in a new incarnation or advent of Ahriman sometime around 1998. Well, 3 short years later, we had the events of 9/11, a catalyzing event that has cascaded and transformed this world in a myriad of ways. And he predicted some 30 years later, from 1998, or from this event in 2001, that perhaps we would see the physical rise to power of a political figure that we would be able to recognize as either Antichrist or Ahriman, and that this alleged physical body of this manifestation of Ahriman would have been born in or around 1998. So this is something interesting to keep in mind, and we can look around and maybe understand a little something about the time frame we are coming up to very quickly, around the year 2030. 2028 through 2031, if you want to look at that framework here, would be about the time, according to what this gentleman is saying, that we might expect to see some big world changes. And have we not seen some major world changes leading up to this? Now, he says here, in parentheses, he said, these are approximate times only. The outer effects of the occult events may manifest only gradually. He says in 1998, this was an afterthought after he had originally written this, he added these notes. In 1998, we did not see newspaper headlines announcing a spectacular supernatural event, but if we had been alive in 666 AD or 1332 AD, neither would we have likely been informed by the then contemporary analogs of the headlines that any major supernatural events had occurred. Those manifestations of evil did not fully succeed according to the plan. Other influences intervened and moderated the outcomes. The occult machinations were hardly known to the public. Such may also be true in the present. The actual course of events depends on many contending forces and upon the consciousness and will of men, and the crux of the struggle will likely be hidden or occulted to the wide public. We will live and or die in the outer effects of the occult causes, as uncomprehending, most of us probably, as is usual in social cataclysms. This essay is an attempt to lessen this incomprehension and to lighten the mental atmosphere of this planet even a little. Surely, as thoughts are things, even a slight change in consciousness can influence physical events in the right direction. And the author of this paper is not wrong. That is why I do the things that I do, why I am bringing this information to you, why it is worthy of discussion, because even a very small effect in this way towards the positive, towards the right direction, can have very excellent real-world effects, can steer us back on track to where we need to be. So if enough people are awake and aware of these spiritual influences in our modern world, we can affect things to a positive result. You see, the controllers of this world right now only seek to steer things toward this negative result, this incarnation of Ahriman or Antichrist, and the development of what is called by Steiner the eighth sphere, trapping humanity into physicality, becoming automatons, essentially biological robots, to be incarnated by the spirits of dark forces in the underworld. And how will these dark forces bring this about? Well, it would appear that the whole plan, from all that I've investigated and I've seen, the whole plan emanating from the pits of hell itself, the underworld, if you want to call it that, the abyss, the sea of chaos that surrounds this physical manifestation in which we live. Those beings, those discarnate beings, those essences, intelligences, forces, entities, whatever you want to call them, from the other side, they want to be able to manifest in physicality here. They don't want to have to answer to the Creator. They don't want to be punished anymore in their prison, in the abyss, in the primordial void of chaos, hell, where they are. They want to trade places with humanity, with the souls of humanity. They want to incarnate physically and live forever, have physical immortality here, so they don't have to be accountable for their actions spiritually. They want to separate spiritually from God, the Creator Himself, and from all spiritual concerns, and exist only as physical beings seeking after the desires of the flesh. This is the eighth sphere. This is hell. That is what they want to build here. That is what they want to trap mankind in through the use of the concept of this doppelganger. They want to achieve this individuated state of consciousness like man has, and they want to use the astral vehicle that is the Ahrimanic double or the doppelganger to inhabit the physical body of man and usurp the soul of man and the spirit of man, culling him in the process and stepping into incarnation here in the physical world. Now, I know this sounds like a bridge too far for a lot of people, but if you explore these avenues of thought enough, you understand how it begins to make sense. So how do they plan on achieving this goal? Well, it's through subtle influences of human beings here now. You see, they use our creative forces within us, our will and imagination, because they have none themselves. This is the same as the allegory of what the Gnostics call the archons. They can't create anything new unto themselves. All they can do is imitate that which already exists. But they can subtly influence human beings in ways so that these human beings build the systems necessary for them to be brought here, into physicality. This is where the digital world comes into play, and the advent of supercomputers and quantum computers and artificial intelligence. It's a housing, a gateway, a stargate, a literal stargate, through which these entities imprisoned in the underworld can step in and force the human beings to take their place in the underworld. The human souls, they want to make the exchange. So they are building a digital sub-layer of this reality, which in essence is a synthetic version of the etheric layer of this reality. Now, much of this would take some delving into the Rosicrucian philosophy and the other teachings of the other secret schools that very much echo the same ideas, using different terms to describe it. The etheric is a sublayer of the physical reality, and it is the connection point back to the source of manifestation. The source of manifestation, according to the Rosicrucian system, comes from the divine world, or the mental plane, steps down through the astral plane to the etheric plane and into dense physical manifestation here in our physical world. This is the process of manifestation. Well, these dark entities, intelligences, want to bypass that process and make their own way, develop their own gateway into manifestation by creating an artificial, synthetic, etheric layer. This is the digital world. You see, it's a stepping down process through manifestation. If you have been listening for any length of time to this broadcast, you'll know what I'm saying, and you will begin to understand the inference here. Because essentially, this is what is being done. You see, technology in and of itself is not a bad thing. But right now, the development of these technologies is being steered and directed by some very dark forces in this world. That is wherein it becomes problematic. And we're beginning to see these things coming online in ways that we could scarcely conceive of. The world's going to look very different in a few short years, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to see a lot of very strange occurrences happening. High strangeness will become more and more regular, as we are already seeing. And what is the reason for the building of these gigantic AI data centers? This has everything to do with the incarnation of Ahriman and the incarnation of the digital world. The building of Web3 technologies. They began to roll this out in the early days of the scamdemic that they laid out on the people a few short years ago as a means of being a stepping stone to get there. And initially, this came out by and large in the mainstream media, being pushed heavily as the notion of the metaverse. Well, all of that has quietly fallen away, but it hasn't gone anywhere. They've just rebranded this whole notion. And they slowed the rollout process of it slightly, because people began to fight back against this type of an advent, or at least the quickness of its approach. They discovered they had to slow down what they were trying to push. They were pushing too quickly, and they were getting a lot of resistance. Plus, there were real physical world obstacles in place that were slowing them down. But now we see the rollout of these AI data centers everywhere. They're building them at a frantic pace. They've invested $500 billion initially into this Stargate project. And they tell you the truth in no uncertain terms if you just pay attention to what they're saying. They can't help themselves. Stargate. You're beginning to understand the implications here. The Antichrist, ladies and gentlemen, will be the first fruits of the transhumanist singularity, the merging of man with these AI technologies. That will be the incarnation of Ahriman in our world. And at such time as everyone is tied into the machine or the beast system, this system, this artificially intelligent system, will be able to control your perceptions of the world, your perceptions of reality. You see, what we're experiencing now is a shifting point in this, a gradual shifting point, wherein it's getting harder and harder and harder for us to discern what is true and what is false in this world. Look at all the AI-generated videos circulating all over social media and all over the place. Deep fakes. It's getting more and more difficult to discern what's true and what's false. Well, when this AI beast system has a direct conduit to your brain and to your physical senses, it can control what you perceive to be true to such a point that you won't be able to tell anymore. And we're seeing the soft rollout of this right now. And when this stuff gets more and more prominent, and when people are effectively wired into the cloud, the computing cloud, through BCI, brain-computer interface devices, That is when your perception of reality itself will change and alter, and you will have no way of knowing what is true or what is false anymore, and you will become an automaton for the big system. This is the mark of the beast. We've seen precursors to this already, and some would argue we've actually seen it. I won't get into that discussion on air here tonight, though. But this digital realm, this digital sublayer, is the infrastructure for the eighth sphere that Steiner spoke about. And if you know how to read between the lines and apply the proper hermeneutical lens of observation to the scriptures of the book of Revelation, you see all of this aligns one-to-one with what's revealed there. It's a chilling thought, but it's one we need to be aware of. But this isn't all doom and gloom, ladies and gentlemen. As I've said, just the very notion of exploring these avenues of thought and these ways of thinking and introducing them into the world and getting more people to ponder upon these things can have a positive influence, can steer us away from this perceived inevitable event. It's perceived as being inevitable, and that is what the controllers of this world take advantage of. You see, they manipulate you based upon what your worldviews are and what your belief systems are, and they use these things, like the book of Revelation, as a blueprint or a roadmap to get things done. Whereas when you see things come to fruition that align with what the Scripture says, well, you think it's God's inevitable plan, it's the fulfilling of prophecy. And yes, that may be true, but it is only because it is a self-fulfilled prophecy. We can still have a positive influence, and we could push these timelines of this Advent or Incarnation of Antichrist or Ahriman back. There's a very specific window of opportunity in the cycles of time here. This is what Steiner was pointing out, for this Advent to come about. And if enough of us are spiritually awake enough and aware of it, we can stave this thing off until such time as a later cycle emerges, wherein these things would be feasible once again for this Ahrimanic influence to take place. But the good news is, if we stave it off now, we can have a better future world, and perhaps some future iteration of this same type of event, this cyclical event, will have a much diminished effect than what it has had now. And if you look back at the examples given here by the author of this research paper pertaining to Steiner's research, you find that that seems to be what Steiner outlined in the past. Even though these spiritual forces attempted similar things in the past, they were quenched, and they had to bide their time and wait for a later cycle of time wherein the window of opportunity was right for them to begin to manifest again. And that time is now, ladies and gentlemen, according to what these cycles of time show. The only difference is now we have the scientific innovations to make it very feasible for these things to be done on a much larger scale than was possible back in those other time periods. But it's important that we don't lose grip or lose sight of the spiritual components of all of this. That is largely what this worldview has led us into, the hyper-materialist paradigm, the Ahrimanic influence in our modern culture. Look to the Spirit. Get your hearts and your minds and your souls right with God, ladies and gentlemen. That is the way forward. He made a way for us. It's simple. It's very simple. It's much more simple than these eggheads within these occult fraternities and mystery schools would like you to believe. All you have to do is accept the free gift that God gave us. He sent His Son, His only begotten Son, Jesus Christ. He made the way in His work on the cross for us. All we have to do is accept that free gift and confess Christ is the Lord with our mouths, and we will receive that spiritual connection that will save us from the building of this digital hell or prison. Accept him in your heart, in your mind, with all your being, and believe his work on the cross made the way possible for us. And that's all there is to it. It's very simple. It flies in the face of all the things these Gnostics and these occultists and everything try to teach. They want you to believe that having a proper spiritual connection to God or a proper type of salvation of sorts comes from attaining knowledge, occult knowledge. Nothing could be further from the truth. He made a way for all of us, for God so loved the world. And his desire is that none should perish, but all should come to this saving knowledge. He doesn't want you to be trapped in the pits of hell. Your soul, trapped in the pits of hell, which he had made for these spiritual essences that stepped in where they didn't belong here in this reality in the past, and messed things up here for us and led man astray. He wants you to have that right relationship. He doesn't want you to be bound to that and have these evil entities manifest in a physical world in this eighth sphere. It is against the natural order, against the laws of nature, and it will meet a catastrophic end, whether those beings that seek to incarnate in that way or not realize it. But we don't have to have a place in that. You need to choose the spiritual concerns over these physical, temporary, finite concerns. We need to reject this notion of the mark of the beast, and that would be what would tie you to this digital system. Those are the times we're living in, ladies and gentlemen, and it's a very interesting time to be alive, for sure. But at the end of the day, it all comes down to an individual choice. You can choose to step into that path, or you could choose to step into the spiritual path, which is where God has ordained that he wants us to be. That is the natural design. That is part of natural law. We are supposed to go to the spiritual path. That is the natural evolutionary path of man, if you want to use that word, to step into the spiritual paradigm, not to fall victim to the trap of physicality and of the animal nature of man. He doesn't want us to become the victim of the doppelganger, the dweller of the threshold. We've talked about some of these ideas on past broadcasts here. If you want to go back and give those a listen, that will give you a little more insight into all the different aspects of this that this all touches upon. But like I said, there is hope. If enough of us turn our eyes to the spiritual and reject many of these plans and plots and schemes that the technocrats on behalf of the dark occultists who run things in this world are trying to foist upon mankind, we can have a better way forward. That's the good news, ladies and gentlemen, and that's the hope. But it all starts with awareness. If you don't understand what you're looking at, how can you fight against it? If you don't know who your enemy is, how can you fight against him? If you don't know the tactics they use, how can you stand in the evil day? That's why we explore these ways of thinking here. I'm a messenger, ladies and gentlemen. Nothing more. My desire is just to present this information to you so that you could ruminate upon it and make decisions of your own as to where you will stand. Because we're coming to a crossroads wherein you're going to need to make a choice. And there's no avoiding that choice or delaying that choice anymore. You're going to stand or you're going to fall. Are you going to choose the easy path or the narrow path? The narrow path being the spiritual path. But that's the one that leads us into a better tomorrow. We need to all make our choice. Anyway, I hope you find value in this information here tonight. I know it's a lot to take in, and we've connected a lot of dots, and we've explained a great many things. I hope you garner something positive from it. I sincerely mean that. Anyway, that is all the time we have for tonight. I want to thank you all for tuning in, and I want to remind you I appreciate each and every one of you more than you could ever know. Have a good night now.